Welcome to RTO District 23's Community Initiative with Toronto Wildlife Centre. Toronto Wildlife Centre was established in 1993 to promote peaceful coexistence of people and wildlife by providing education and expert advice about wildlife situations and by providing medical care for sick, injured, orphaned wild animals, with the ultimate goal of releasing healthy animals back into the wild. It is the only wildlife rehabilitation center in the city of Toronto, and it deals with over 270 different species of wildlife, from hummingbirds to wolves and everything in between. This is the second of 3 sessions on strategies to support urban wildlife. This session deals with coexisting with wildlife neighbors and is called Remarkable Residents, Busting Myths and Misconceptions. Today, our speaker will be Victoria Badham. Victoria is the Communication and Education Director at Toronto Wildlife Centre. She has a degree in Environmental Policy and Urban Studies and a Master's in Education from the University of Toronto. After responding to thousands of hotline calls from wildlife emergencies to requests for general wildlife information, it increased her awareness of the vast issues affecting urban wildlife, as well as commonly held misconceptions about various wildlife species and the urgent need for broader public education. Her aim is to inspire children, youth, adults alike to respect and connect with nature and the amazing wildlife species with whom we share our neighborhood. Before we start, I want to just say that we've muted everybody's mics. However, if you have a question, please use the chat and we will be monitoring that. Ladies and gentlemen, here's Victoria.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today again with all of you. I'm not sure if you joined us for the first session that we did last month, which was on birds, all sorts of different birds across the city. So like Cheryl said, today we're going to focus on some of our other different wild neighbors that we share this wonderful Greater Toronto area with. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the common animals, some of the feared animals, some of the weird animals, and of course the revered animals. So let's get started. Just to give you a bit of background about Toronto Wildlife Centre. So like Cheryl said, we've been open every day since 1993. So that's holidays, weekends, every single day of the year to help sick, injured, and orphaned wildlife. We typically admit around 5,000 animals a year. However, 2021 was a record-breaking year for us. We admitted over 6,500 different animals for help. And that's from over 300 different species. So our numbers actually have gone up, that we've actually dealt with over 300 different species now. And our wildlife hotline handles about 40,000 calls a year from members of the public like yourselves. So people who need information on how to help an animal that is sick or injured, or sometimes just general questions about why a certain animal might be coming into the yard. And so we handle all of those every day of the year as well. 1,000 wild animals rescued. So this is our specialized wildlife rescue team that go out and save animals that are in difficult or dangerous situations. So in most cases, for example, if you found a pigeon that couldn't fly on the street, we would ask you to contain that animal and bring it to the center. That's how most of our animals arrive. But of course, there are some situations that are too dangerous for members of the public to handle. So if a deer has fallen deep down inside a pit, or if a red-tailed hawk is caught in kite string 50 feet up a tree, that's when we send out our wildlife rescue team to come and save the animal. Through our education program, like today, we reach about 5,000, up to 5,000 people per year, as well as additional through all of our social media channels and our newsletters. And we are a charity, so we do operate almost entirely on donations. And we're the only wildlife hospital in Toronto and one of 2 in the Greater Toronto area. So not too many wildlife rehabilitation centers out there, unfortunately. So to give you a little bit of a look at what we do, I'm going to share a video with you to see some of our work in action.
Hello, I'm calling about a wildlife situation emergency.
I just found a small beaver who was run over.
There's a crane that is hanging from a tree by either a fishing line or wire.
There seems to be an oil spill in the creek.
It's a baby hog. It's caught in the pigeon netting on the 3rd floor.
And this is an emergency, so I hope someone can come down as soon as they can. Please, I need a call ASAP.
My whole life I've noticed the things that people do to affect wild animals and the challenges that wild animals have living in our built world. And I've always wanted to give back and to try to do something to undo that. For me, that's the daily motivation to keep doing this kind of work.
Literally, the phone rings and we're responding to whatever's needs to be done. So a typical day doesn't exist.
If animals got hurt or their mothers got lost, they might have came here. We're actually trying to help them and care for them.
The days are long, but they never seem long enough. There's always a lot to do. There's always a lot that we can do to make things better.
There's always something going on. There's always a lot of activity. So there is no typical day, and that's why I like it so much.
So every day, sick, injured, and orphaned animals are brought to Toronto Wildlife Centre, and if we weren't here, these animals would just have nowhere to go.
For the wild animals that are in need, TWC is imperative because we have the ability to specialize in these species, to have focused care for these species, and to have the resources where these species have the chance to succeed.
Toronto Wildlife Centre, of course, is really important to wild animals because we literally save their lives every single day. But also for humans, we're really, really important because human beings, when they find a wild animal in crisis, are really upset.
If somebody finds an animal, whether it's a dog, a cat, a wild bird, or a wild raccoon, they really want to have some way to help it. If they cared enough to pick the animal up in the first place, then they care enough to take it somewhere. So we're just as much a service for the community as we are for the patients that we treat.
And really, with the only center of its kind in the GTA, I think they really serve a vital purpose here.
If TWC didn't exist, I think there would be a lot of very sad animal cases.
Because if there wasn't Toronto Wildlife Centre, then we would see a lot of dead animals or hurt animals.
The community would also lose a tremendous resource for just education about wild animals. Everything from mitigating damage to how to gently and humanely harass them away from problem areas, to even just trying to instill a sense of compassion for our wildlife neighbors, which most people don't see on a regular basis.
We're not only dealing with bringing in sick, injured, and orphan animals, we're also dealing with situations where people just need to know what to do.
Through our hotline, I mean, we save more wild animals' lives, I think, than all the other work that we do put together at Toronto Wildlife Centre.
Let's think of the positive side. Toronto Wildlife Centre is really great to me. I really like it.
So I think just by being here and by having the tremendous support of our donors and our volunteers and the staff that are so dedicated, we're just able to give these animals a chance that they wouldn't ordinarily have.
I have been so incredibly touched and so strengthened, every single day by the amazing community of people that we have around us. Whether it's the donors who provide the funds to do the work that we do, or the volunteers who come in and work alongside the also hardworking staff and work really, really long hours to help, or just members of the community every day who come across situations. It's amazing what you see in people in our line of work, and it's very touching to me to see how much people care.
Our rescue staff are on the way. We should be there shortly, and hopefully we can find a way to get this animal into our hospital and get it the help it needs.
Okay, there you go. So a little bit of a firsthand view of what we're doing every day at Toronto Wildlife Centre. So I'll just go back to my slides. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I wanted to start by asking all of you, and maybe you can just pop it into the chat box. What's the most unusual wild animal you've seen in your neighborhood or around the Greater Toronto area? Is there anything that comes to mind when you think of some of the common or the weird or the revered animals that are living in our cities? Anybody want to share some of the unusual wildlife they've seen? Or ones that you might not expect to be in your neighborhood? Just give you guys a second. Does no one see any weird wildlife around? Deer in the East Don River watershed. So that's a really great one. I remember the first time I saw a deer in Toronto, and I told my friend, and they're like, there's no deer in Toronto. I'm like, they're right there in the Don Valley. I saw them going on the subway over the bridge from Broadview to Castle Frank. So yeah, that's definitely one that people don't expect to see. 2 coyotes greeted by a dog. Yeah, that happens for sure. Opossums. We're going to talk a little bit about those guys today. Deer, again, yeah, people are generally pretty surprised to see deer in their neighborhoods in a big city like this. A few people saying deer. Yeah, so absolutely. A hawk, yeah, lots of birds of prey around the city too. In fact, there's red-tailed hawks are actually, there's quite a few of them around our city. It's pretty neat seeing them. 3 deer being stalked by a coyote in York Cemetery, red fox. So this is great. So really, you guys are already recognizing that there's a wide diversity, really broad diversity of wildlife that are living in our city. This creature that we see up on our screen is a star-nosed mole. And that was one when I started working at the Wildlife Center that I didn't even know such a creature existed. And the little guy had been dug up, and they live underground. So that's why you don't see them too often. So I'll just always remember it, because I was like, wow, this is a very unusual animal. And like, how many other animals do I not know actually live in our city? So even for us that work at Toronto Wildlife Center, we're always learning more. We're always, getting new and unusual species come in. Sometimes they've gone up, birds that have gone off course and that kind of thing. So it's a constant learning process. And it's really cool when we get to see these animals up close. So the thing that I would like to really let people know is that wild animals live everywhere, right? As you've seen by the types of animals that were coming up in the chat after we asked that question, wild animals are everywhere, right? They don't just stay out in nature, so to speak, right? They live in our cities, they live in our suburbs. There's lots of different species everywhere. So the Greater Toronto Area is actually home to, or on the migratory path of 410 bird species. That's a lot of different birds. 38 mammal species, 24 reptile and amphibian species, 110 butterfly species. To me, that was really shocking to learn that there was that many different butterfly species that either live in or pass through our city. The next one may not be as appreciated, 200 spider species, but these are important as well. These insects are important as well. 364 bee species and 100 fish species. So of course, Toronto Wildlife Center only deals with birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, but insects and fish species also have important roles to play in our ecosystems as well. And these numbers just really show the diversity of life that's living in our city. Pretty amazing. Now, what we often hear on our hotline is that people think that certain animals don't always belong in a city. I think, what are they doing here? Where did they come from? So just want to go over a few things regarding that. Wild animals are part of our communities, right? They have always been here. They're beneficial. They're part of our urban ecosystem, and each of these species has a role to play. Now, it's not surprising that they want to be here, because look at this beautiful picture of Toronto. We have lots of green space. We have lots of parks. We have ravines. We have big, lush neighborhoods. And those areas are attractive to people. And of course, they're going to be attractive to wildlife. So they're going to come into those spaces and use them, because they provide the kind of habitat that they need to survive. Some people will ask, well, how did they get here in the first place? Well, these animals haven't come from elsewhere. They've always been here, and the city has built up around them. So we've developed around these species that have already been living here for, millennia for a lot of them. So it's not like they're coming from an outside rural area and moving into the city. They've been here, they've adapted, they continue to live here. However, as they live closer and closer with people, as our city continues to develop and as we get more populated, encounters between people and wildlife are going to increase. So these animals do face some unique threats as a result of living so close to people. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So I'm going to start off with common species. And these are the ones that, you know, I think most of us will recognize as regular inhabitants of the greater Toronto area, right? So skunks, raccoons, pigeons, squirrels, we see these on pretty much a day-to-day basis for some of them. Now, why are there so many of them? Why do they live here? Well, some wild animals are actually better adapted to city life than some other species. And that's typically as a result of the availability of appropriate shelter and food, and the fact that they're sort of more generalists, right? They can cope better with certain types of stressors. Their diet is a little bit more broad, so they can eat well. Like a raccoon, for example, has a pretty diverse diet. It can survive off of quite a few different items of food. So they tend to be able to be like maintain their populations in cities. However, they still face unique threats because of sharing space with people. So, you know, for example, little skunks might den up under somebody's deck when they're having a family. You know, raccoons, we commonly hear about getting into people's garbage. It might be considered a nuisance. Squirrels might get into somebody's attic. Pigeons are historically cliff dwellers, so they take full advantage of high buildings that are similar to cliffs, and that's why they nest on apartment balconies. So, you know, we're sharing these spaces with these animals that, just like people, they're just trying to find a safe space to live. Now, we do promote peaceful coexistence between people and wildlife at Toronto Wildlife Centre. So that means that we're not saying, oh, we have to get rid of them, right? We want to find ways that we can promote tolerance, to accept that they are here, and that we can live together, peacefully without harming animals. So one thing I am going to talk about, because spring is approaching, is trapping and relocating wildlife. We see this a lot at this time of year because, of course, animals are starting to den up. They're going to be having their babies soon. And sometimes they don't pick the best locations, according to people, to raise their family. So this might be, like I said, an attic, it could be a shed, it could be under somebody's deck, and the homeowner may not appreciate them being there. So a lot of people will use a humane live trap to catch the animal and move it to a new location. So this, obviously, it seems like a good thing, right? The animal is being taken away from the location you don't want it in. It's not hurting the animal, right? They're just being moved to a new location, a lot of the times to a more rural or natural location. However, it isn't actually a humane alternative. The reason for that is, especially at this time of year, we see a lot of orphaned babies because of trapping and relocating. So what tends to happen is somebody's seeing a raccoon coming in and out of their roof, and they think, oh gosh, like I don't want the raccoon living in my roof, but I don't want to hurt them either. So they get the trap, they trap the raccoon, they put the raccoon in the trap in their car, and they drive it, 10 kilometers away to the nearest, ravine natural area. And they go, okay, good, great. I don't have a raccoon in my roof anymore. Raccoon's happy in the wild, yay. However, 2 or 3 days later, they start to hear crying in that attic. And then they realize that that was a mother raccoon that had babies. And now the babies are orphaned and there's no way to reunite them. And that happens a lot. It is one of a very big reason for orphaning in cities, is trapping and relocating mothers, because people didn't realize that they actually had babies in a den. So, for example, squirrels will have their babies probably pretty deep into an attic. Same thing with raccoons. Skunks will have maybe their babies down underground in a den. So you can't often see the babies when they're very, very young. The other thing is that relocated wildlife actually don't tend to survive when they're moved to a new location. There was a study done on urban raccoons that showed that they, in a city like Toronto, they typically have a territory of about 3 city blocks. So that's very, very small area, right, to be living in. That's where they know where to find food. That's where they know to find shelter. That's where they know where all their den sites are. And they have many, they usually have 10 to 12 den sites. So if that raccoon is trapped and moved to, a location in the middle of the wild, this raccoon that's used to, foraging in garbages and sleeping in somebody's rooftop isn't really going to know what to do. They've also been moved into a new animal's territory. So now they're struggling to find food, shelter, and they're competing with other animals that are already there. So studies have shown that relocating wildlife, not a great idea. They actually, even without babies, they typically don't survive. Now with traps as well, like we do use humane live traps at Toronto Wildlife Centre when we're trying to catch an injured animal or a sick animal that is maybe not coming out in the daytime when our staff are working. However, the traps do have to be monitored constantly. So we always say if somebody's trying to catch perhaps, like an opossum in their neighborhood that's got frostbite on its tail or something like that, we tell them to set it in the evening, monitor it every 10 to 15 minutes, let out any of the wrong animals, and don't leave it set up overnight when you're sleeping. Because this is what happens. This little guy, this opossum, was actually caught in one of the live traps that was actually set up to catch feral cats. And the homeowner who was trying to catch these cats felt just terrible when she found this opossum in there. And he had done serious damage to his entire, to his teeth, broken some teeth all around his nose. So he had to actually have surgery to repair some of the damage that had been done. And that's because animals, once they're in those traps, are very stressed. They're really going to do anything they can to try and get out. So when Toronto Wildlife Centre is using them, we're using them knowing that we're going to be bringing that animal in immediately as soon as they get into that trap or as soon as we're open in the morning. So that's another thing that can happen as a result of traps. And of course, like I said, we really want to keep these wild families together. So if we're moving mothers away, then we have a lot of orphaning situations. And because Toronto Wildlife Centre is a charity, we have limited resources. There's only so many babies that we can take. And I can tell you that unfortunately, our capacity does not meet the demand for help. So we sadly have to turn some of these babies away. So we really want to be proactive in our approach to dealing with wildlife rather than reactive, right? The more families we can keep together, then that is fewer orphans that have to come to Toronto Wildlife Centre for help. So you're probably thinking, okay, that's great. You don't want me to trap and relocate these animals that are living in my attic or what have you. What do I do? So when possible, we encourage tolerance. So is this a location where the animal can stay, right? So is it really necessary that, an animal living under a deck leaves? Maybe it is, depending on the situation, but really thinking about, like, do they have to move? Because it's always stressful when a mother has to move her babies. If it's a shed you never use, it's, just in a little covered area, the animal might be okay to stay there depending on what it is. However, if they're living, for example, in your attic, and it's probably not the best idea to have wildlife living inside of your home, then there are approaches you can take to encourage them to leave on their own. So it's not forcibly removing them. It's taking means to make them think, this is not such a safe den site anymore. I'm going to move my babies elsewhere. And this especially works well for raccoons and squirrels. So for example, you can light up the area that you don't want them in. So overnight, just put a big bright light on. And that's going to be like, oh, my dark, cozy space is not so dark and cozy anymore. On the second night, if they're still there, adding a radio just on a talk station like 680 News, just to let them know, okay, it's bright and light, and I hear people talking at me all the time. This is getting really annoying. I don't like that. And as a third step, if they're still not leaving, you can use scent deterrents like apple cider vinegar. You would just soak some rags in the vinegar, put them in a bag with some holes in it, and you would place those around the area where the animal is living, especially where they're coming and going. And that can be enough of a deterrent for mom to go, ugh, I don't like this house anymore. I'm going to go and move my babies to one of my other den sites. So on our website at torontowildlifecentre.com, we have lots of information about how to deal with what we call nuisance situations. So if there's an animal that is on your property, you're not sure what to do, can visit our website, go to the I have a problem with an animal section, and we have raccoons, we have ducks, we have squirrels, we have pigeons, every different species that could potentially cause a problem are there, and you can find lots of good information there. And I always recommend checking that first before taking any action to ensure that it's the safest and most humane method being used to solve that conflict. So the next animals I would like to speak about are the feared and misunderstood species. So again, going back to our chat, I'm wondering, and no judgment here, it's really just for the sake of like discussion. What words would you use to describe a coyote? Just, one or two words. You can write it in the chat box, just kind of interested in hearing some of the terms that you might use when you're thinking about coyotes or talking about coyotes. I'll just give you a second to a small German Shepherd. That's a good one. They definitely do have that look to them for sure. Fearful of humans. Okay, great. Cute, but potentially dangerous. Missing cats. That's a big one. Okay. I'll just give another few seconds here, see if any other ones are coming up. Rabbits are gone. Fear to pets and children, to harm pets and children. I think that's probably what it says. Yeah, so a lot of these points that you are all bringing up are points that everybody across the city brings up. So I was saying before we started this presentation that in 2021, we at Toronto Wildlife Center's hotline, we handled about 1,100 calls from members of the public just about coyotes. So only coyotes, about 1,100 calls, and some of them were for sick and injured coyotes, but a lot of them are just answering questions about this species that lives in our midst that kind of has a little bit of a bad rap because just the way that they're portrayed in the media and the way people have learned about them, even in movies, right? Like wolves and coyotes are always the bad guy in movies. So it's kind of ingrained in us that they could be a little bit dangerous. So I thank everybody for putting those into the chat. And we're just going to dive into that a little bit further. So these are the types of things that we hear a lot when we're talking about coyotes, and especially in the media, we hear it a lot. As well as from members of the public who often have read something either, in a newspaper or heard it on the news regarding coyotes. So aggressive is one thing that we hear a lot. So compared to the natural behaviors of coyote, we would describe that more as protective. So if a coyote, is approaching, if it's coming around a lot, why is it doing that? Does it have a family nearby? Is it denning nearby? Is it watching out for its young? That's more likely what's going on because it is highly unusual for a coyote just to be aggressive for no good reason, right? So you have to remember they do have territory as well in their own minds, which might also be your territory. So not that they're becoming aggressive with people necessarily, although we have seen some examples of that, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well as why that behavior might be happening. So another one we hear a lot is the coyote is stalking me or it's stalking my dog. So this is really common behavior for coyotes, and it's actually called escorting. So if a coyote has a family nearby, has a den nearby, like I said, they have this territory, right? That they're kind of watching out who's coming in and out of their area. So say you're walking by with your dog, the coyote is thinking, oh, there is a stranger there. What's going on? I have to protect my babies. So all they're really doing is walking with you to see where you're going, to make sure that you're actually leaving their territory. I kind of compare it to if a stranger walked up onto your lawn, you would probably look out your window and go, why is that stranger there? And if they walked closer to your building, your home, you'd be like, oh my goodness, what are they doing? I'm really watching this now. I want to see what they're doing. And as they're leaving, you might even walk out your door and kind of look down the street just to make sure that they're really leaving for good. So it's the same kind of thing with the coyote. They're really watching you. They want to see what you're doing and making sure that you're moving on and that you're not a concern for them. Preying, of course, they are a predator and they do prey on food. but preying often has a negative connotation to it, that word. So really they're hunting for food, right? They're looking for food to sustain them and their family. And most often that's going to be small rodents like mice and rats. So they do help control rodent populations. And also animals like rabbits. So like smaller animals are typically what they eat. They are only about 30 pounds, and that's a bigger coyote. They sometimes look bigger than that. So it's highly unusual for them to even go after a big animal like a deer. You know, research has shown that the vast majority of their diet is small rodents. This is a big one. A coyote attacked me, or a woman was attacked in a park by a coyote. Actual attacks by coyotes on people are extremely rare. In 2009, there was a Statistics Canada study done that showed that on average, there were about 2.5 bites or scratches from coyotes to people every year. 2.5 bites or scratches. So that would actually be like touching, right? Making a connection, like a touching connection, compared to 450,000 known bite and scratches from dogs to people. So that's a, you know, just to kind of put the risk in perspective, it's highly, highly unlikely that you will ever be attacked by a coyote. However, you may encounter a coyote more often. And an encounter is simply that you've been in close proximity to a coyote. And I think it really shows that, you know, coyotes actually don't really, aren't a dangerous risk to us when we consider how many encounters there are. And there are a lot. Like a lot of the time, people are calling our hotline because they've had an encounter, but it hasn't turned into anything negative as a result. So again, that's just, you know, coyotes may be coming because they have a den nearby, they may have babies, they may just be passing through the neighborhood. And then some other terms we hear too, that they're really brazen or they're bold, when they're actually quite intelligent and curious. They want to check out what's going on. They're not approaching you, again, with always having the thought of attacking you in mind. In fact, all wild animals really want to avoid conflict whenever possible because their life is on the line. So, you know, most of the time they're really just checking out what's going on. Again, that image of the wily coyote rather than intelligent, which they are a highly intelligent animal. They're very social. Their social structures are very intricate. And another reason why we don't really want to mess up their family dynamics too much by removing a parent or what have you, because they all have really critical roles to play within their families. And of course, a nuisance, right? Of course, there are people that believe that they don't belong in cities, but again, they haven't come in from elsewhere. They have always been here. And removing them just opens up more territory for new coyotes to come in. They're very hard to catch. So really you're talking about lethal means repeatedly to keep a coyote population down in a city. And once that territory opens up, then new coyotes are just going to move in. So it really doesn't make sense according to the research. So we prefer to really promote them as part of our urban ecosystem. They are here to stay. So how can we take steps to live peacefully with them?
Vicki?
So yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We had a question from one of our participants today, Mervyn, who had a question that was really quite related to the last point you brought up.
Okay.
So he asked if you had any comments on, I believe it would be the Toronto Star's recent debate on the culling or hunting of coyotes. Now, I'm not sure whether you had just general comments about, you know, there's been a lot of talk in the news lately about culling and these hunting contests that have been happening that have received a lot of scrutiny. So just any thoughts you might have had on that.
Yes, so I did read that this morning. It was sent to me by Cheryl, thank you. So basically this Toronto Star posted two opposing viewpoints, one in support of hunting coyotes, the other not in support of hunting coyotes. Of course, Toronto Wildlife Centre does not support the hunting of coyotes. This came about because of a hunting competition in Belleville by Chester's General Store, I believe it's called. So they're actually having a coyote killing contest, or they had it. I believe it's finished already, in which, you know, there's prizes for the biggest coyote, the smallest coyote. It's really quite violent and horrible in my opinion. And the idea is that it's going to reduce coyote populations, help farmers, that kind of thing. But we know from the scientific research that that doesn't happen, right? New coyotes come into their territory, into those territories. They have higher litter numbers when coyote populations are down. So it just, you know, it's really just perpetually killing coyotes, which isn't a permanent solution. It was also brought up in that article, which is true, that when older coyotes or parent coyotes are killed, leaving young, they miss out on really valuable learning opportunities. And that can really affect their behavior in the future as well. So we do want to keep those mature coyotes in those intricate family structures to be teaching the young how to behave as proper coyotes. That's really, really important. And I think another thing to understand too is that it's actually in the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act that you're not allowed to make gains from killing wildlife. So we're not really sure why this competition is allowed to continue, because there are cash prizes. So it's a little confusing. Nobody's been able to get a clear answer as to why it's allowed, considering it contravenes the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act. So that's a question that, you know, I think we need to put pressure onto our MPPs to get an answer as to why now for the second year in a row it's been allowed to happen. And the other thing too is that, you know, it's kind of framed as like it's good for hunters. And the pro article that's in the Star is written by the Federation of Anglers and Hunters as a representative from there. But not all hunters support the killing of coyotes. You have to remember they don't eat their meat. They are supposed to use their pelts, but we don't really know where exactly the pelts are going to. So you know, it isn't necessarily supported even by all hunters who, you know, don't really see the reckless killing of coyotes as something that we should be doing. Because of course, remember, they play an important role in our ecosystem as well. And when we see large numbers of animals from any species removed from a small geographic ecosystem, then it's definitely going to have repercussions. So yeah, that's our stance. I mean, we would never support that kind of a competition. And like in the vast majority of cases, like lethal means for coyote situations are just not necessary. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer the question? Is that good? Hopefully that's helpful.
I can let Mervyn speak. I can let Mervyn put his, if he has any follow-up questions into the chat, but I think from our perspective, that would be pretty good. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so how can we live peacefully with coyotes? So almost always, in fact, I think I can only think of one instance in all of the coyote situations that we've dealt with where feeding wasn't the known cause of the problem. And it still could have been the cause, it's just we didn't know about it beforehand. So coyotes will become more habituated to people when they can start approaching people for food. And that can be intentional feeding or unintentional feeding. So examples of unintentional feeding include overflowing garbages, as we can see in this photo, fruit that is dropped from trees that's just lying on the ground. You know, that can attract them to come closer for a free meal, because like any animal, they're going to take advantage of that. Even bird feeders can have a negative, not intended consequence, as well as other animals come to feed off the seed that's fallen on the ground, like mice. And then predators such as, you know, hawks, foxes, coyotes will come after those animals that are now being attracted to the feeder. And of course, hand feeding is the absolute worst for any animal, because that will really habituate them to people. It teaches them that they get a reward for coming close to people. And for animals like foxes and coyotes, you definitely don't want to reinforce that it's okay to come close to people, because that's when we start hearing those things in the news, those stories in the news about, you know, coyotes constantly approaching people. Every single time we work with Coyote Watch Canada a lot. They do field research in those areas. We work with Toronto Animal Services. Every time it's a result of unintentional, or even more often, unfortunately, intentional feeding. So feeding is a really bad thing. It creates the vast majority of problems with coyotes, and it's something we want to avoid at all costs. So some other myths and misconceptions is that leaving food in a location away from your home will encourage the coyotes not to come into your yard. So that's not true. If you're leaving food in another location, you're only encouraging those coyotes to be a problem in that other location. They might still have to pass through your yard to get to that location. So any kind of feeding, not recommended. There's also sometimes an idea that coyotes have nothing to eat, so that they will starve if we don't feed them. Again, not true. We really, coyotes and foxes, there's so many rodents in cities, right? They have a buffet. So they are perfectly capable of finding their own food. And then again, you know, this idea that they don't belong in cities. Why is it my responsibility to keep spaces clean? Well, it's good for not attracting a variety of different wildlife, including rats and mice, right? So if coyotes and foxes are coming near, I mean, most often it's for the rats and mice that are also taking advantage of that food as well. So it's just, you know, we have to be careful. The humans create these food situations, so it is our responsibility to make sure that we clean up after ourselves properly. Now, I never miss an opportunity to share pictures of my pets. So this is my cat, Sonic, and this is my little Chihuahua, Chico. And the reason I share them is because, you know, a lot of people say, oh, you know, our pets are at risk. And it's true. If they are unattended, your pets are at risk. This is true. So for example, for Sonic, you know, I want to make sure that she stays with me a very long time. So I'm going to make sure she's indoors with me. She's an indoor cat. She doesn't go outside. That's what's going to protect her. You know, for Chico, if he's outdoors with me, I want to keep him close and pick him up if I do see a coyote. Now, that's another good question. Like, what do you do if you see a coyote? So if they're off in a field, not close to you, they're hunting in a hydro field or something like that, they're fine. They're just, you know, partaking in natural behaviors. However, if they're on their street coming to your backyard, you do want to reinforce that they shouldn't come near you. So that's standing up tall, waving your arms, screaming at them, letting them know, hey, this is not a good place for you to be. You need to leave. And the more people that do that when they're in inappropriate spaces, the better chance that they're going to stop coming around. Never run away from a coyote. They are a canid, right? They're related to dogs. So just like dogs will engage in play and chase, if you run away, a coyote will do the same thing. So some pet safety tips: keeping cats indoors or on a leash no more than 3 feet long, or in a predator-proof outdoor enclosure that we like to call a catio. Keeping little dogs like Chico on a leash no more than 3 feet, and picking them up if there's a coyote nearby. A lot of times smaller dogs get into trouble when they're on those extend leashes, the ones that they can pull as far as they want to. A coyote could potentially take a little dog that's 10 feet away from you. It's not close enough. They'll run by, they'll snatch it, and off they go. So, and the reason is not because they're, you know, trying to be horrible animals. They cannot differentiate between a pet and a wild animal, right? We see that picture of the rabbit and that little cat on the bottom of the screen. They look very similar to us, let alone a coyote, right? They just look like dinner. So it's just something that we have to keep in mind and take responsibility for. Now at Toronto Wildlife Center, yeah.
Hi. So sorry to interrupt again. I have another question that's come up in the chat that's relevant to what you just spoke about. So so Judy has asked, now, do we respond to an approaching large coy wolf? She referred to something as 70 plus pounds as to a coyote, and they also do have a small dog with them.
Right. So it's a really good question, and because the coy wolf term comes up quite a bit. So there is no, coy wolf is a nickname. It's a nickname that has sort of been bantered around the media. But they're real, and some people do use the term coy wolf, but it isn't an actual scientific name. So the actual name for the coyotes that are across the Greater Toronto Area are the only type of coyotes we have here are Eastern coyote. And Eastern coyotes are a mix of coyote, wolf, and some dog genes. So they all have that. So when we say coy wolf, there's no difference between a coyote and a coy wolf. They're all the same. They have the dispersed genes the same way. Now some can be larger than others, but really coyotes are topping out at about 30 pounds. They are tall and they are very furry. So they sometimes look a lot bigger than they actually are. And one reason too why I like to rather use the term eastern coyote rather than coy wolf is that coy wolf sort of implies that there's something different about those animals. That they're a different genetic, mutation, whatever, than the regular coyote, and they're not. Western coyotes and eastern wolves mated about 100 years ago. It's much more intricate than that. I'm just giving you a really simple answer. And that has kind of created what our eastern coyote is today. And those are the same animals that have been in the Greater Toronto Area for the past 100 years. There is nothing biologically different about the animals today than there was 100 years ago. So that's another, I just tend to not use the word coy wolf for that reason. But the response would be the same. So whether it's a bigger looking coyote or a smaller looking coyote, the response is the same. And that is to stand tall, make yourself big, wave your arms, scream. You can pick up sticks and whatnot around you and throw it in the direction of the coyote, not to hit them, but just to kind of scare them away. If you're encountering coyotes often, because the noise in cities is, it makes them so used to a lot of different noises and they get a little less scared. Something new can be more scary for them. So bringing an umbrella and popping it open, that popping sound is kind of freaky for them, and this big thing flying open toward them, as well as big black garbage bags, filling them with air. They make that popping noise. And that's a really good way to scare them off as well. But when that's done, like, they always run away. There's very few cases where we're hearing them like still hanging around, and those are coyotes that are being fed purposely. So it's a very effective tool. If you see them, again, if they're not in an appropriate area, scare them off. It's the best thing you can do for them. So sarcoptic mange is a disease that we do see them with quite a bit, and we admit that's the vast majority of the reasons why coyotes come into Toronto Wildlife Center. So it's a little parasite that digs under their skin, and it makes them very itchy and sick. And it's a bit of a downward spiral for them. They get really weak. They can't hunt, which makes them weaker. And it's a really downhill for them, and it can be fatal. So if you ever do see a coyote with mange, and you can see this is a bigger looking coyote in this picture too, but again, likely in the 30-pound range. You would call our wildlife hotline and to report it, and we would ask you some questions just to determine what's going on with it, how bad the mange is, how often you're sighting it, because it is really tricky to catch these animals. Then we would send out our wildlife rescue team if we thought it was a good opportunity to capture the coyote, and they would either use nets or sometimes we use a specific trap that we have to get them contained. Once back at the center, our wildlife rehabilitation staff would give them an assessment to see, what else is going on. Sometimes, they're not as bad as some other animals. This one's not suffering too badly, and they would create a treatment plan. And the parasite clears up very quickly, but often it can take 2 months or so until all of the other affected areas are cleared up, like any infections or wounds as a result. And sometimes even surgery is required in order to repair like I said, any wounds. They might need some sutures, some little tiny amputations from their tails sometimes, before we can return them back to the wild. So I have a video I'd like to share that's, it's not a coyote, it's a fox actually. And it was one of the worst cases of mange that I had ever seen at Toronto Wildlife Center. And we were able to rehabilitate this guy, but just to kind of give you an idea of the devastation that mange can cause. Okay, so like I said, one of the worst cases that we've seen at Toronto Wildlife Center, but happily it was a happy ending. So I'll just get my slides back on here. Great. So,
All right, Vicki.
Yes.
Before we move on from coyotes, we have one more question from Mervyn. So we just covered mange, but he was also wondering about rabies. Is that something we have to be concerned about?
So coyotes are not considered a rabies vector species, which would be bats, skunks, raccoons, and foxes. And just what that means is that those are the species that are more likely to contract rabies. However, with the baiting system in Ontario, rabies is almost non-existent in skunks, foxes, and raccoons. It's like the numbers are incredibly low. And then until we had the outbreak in 2017 for raccoons, I think it was 2017, we hadn't had a case of raccoon rabies in like 10 or 15 years. It was a very long time. We do still see some rabies in bat populations, but again, it's only like 1 to 2% of the population. So very, very low. Of course, you wouldn't want to take any unnecessary risks with handling these animals. You still want to take all the necessary precautions, but it isn't something that we should be worried about. A lot of people, when they see an animal that's behaving not right, they automatically think it's rabies, and it's almost always not. So just to keep that in mind. So with coyotes, although I guess as a mammal, potentially they could contract it, it's just like highly, highly, highly unlikely that they would. Not impossible, but again, not one of the 4 rabies vector species that we consider. However, bats that's a good segue into bats. Now, these guys, people do fear them. Some people are even surprised that they live in our cities, but we do have some pretty healthy bat populations in the Greater Toronto area. So some questions we hear are definitely rabies. So, you know, we do test for rabies if we ever had a bat that comes in that is suspicious, and occasionally we do get positive tests, but we almost always know ahead of time that it most likely is that just due to their behavior. So of course you wouldn't want to handle a bat with your hands ever, just as a safety precaution, but just remembering that the vast majority of these animals do not have rabies. One of the benefits that they provide is they eat a lot of insects. So they're really great at keeping like mosquito populations down, for example. One bat can eat approximately 5,000 mosquitoes or insects in one night. So thank you, bats. Yeah, I don't think anybody likes to have mosquitoes hanging around. Another myth that we hear sometimes is that, you know, the bats are bloodsuckers, right? So some bats, there's about 1,300 species of bats in the world, and only 3 of them are actually feed on blood itself. So all of our Ontario bats are insectivores. So they, like I said, they do a great job of keeping our insect populations under control. Another big reason why people fear bats often is because when we share pictures of them, they often look like this picture that I've just put up in the bottom right corner, right? Showing their teeth, looking very aggressive. So that's a defensive posture for a bat. So somebody is up in his face, they're either holding him or handling him, and he's saying, I don't like to be touched, I'm scared, I don't know what to do. And that's the types of photos we, like the news or like stories or movies tend to share of bats, where most of the time bats look like this handsome fella that's right up in the middle of your screen, right? Just a cute little face. You know, that's how they normally look unless they're being provoked. So some other interesting facts about bats. Oops, sorry, we got my head there. Just try to move my screen out of the way here. So they're actually the only mammal that can fly, that can actually fly. So we know we hear about flying squirrels, but they're actual gliders. They don't fly like a bat does. People associate them with rodents, but they're actually not related at all. And they live a very long time, so 20 to 30 years. They have their own language and a really complex communication system based on clicks and trills to communicate with one another. And they need our help. So there's 3 bat species in Ontario that are endangered: little brown bats, northern long-eared bats, and tricolored bats. So everything we can do to help them is really important. You've probably heard of what
Vicky, just so you know, Vicky, if you can hear me, you're actually muted right now.
Oh no. How long have I been muted for?
Probably about 5-6 seconds. I was trying to figure out if I was also muted.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I was just talking about that there are a lot of, there are 3 species of bats that are endangered, and little brown bats, especially, we're seeing with white nose syndrome, which is something that you have probably heard of, where they get a fungus on their nose and it causes them to come out of hibernation early. And then they use up all their fat and energy stores. And there's other associated issues with that as well. So everything we can do to help bats is really important. If you find a bat outside in the winter, it needs to come to Toronto Wildlife Centre. It will not survive the winter. So I always call our hotline, or check our website. There's information on how you can safely contain a bat without touching it. And then we keep those bats in our care until the weather warms up in the spring. Sometimes we even have to do surgeries on bats, like this little guy that had a broken bone in their wing. So we had to put him under anesthetic to stabilize that broken bone. If you really love bats, you may want to actually encourage them to come to your property by putting up a bat box. And you can find more information on that by looking up the Canada Bat Box Project. It gives them a good place, especially bats like big brown bats, and can roost in like actual human infrastructure, like attics and roofs. It can give them a nice place to go outside of your building. Oh, and I have a little bat video too before we move on. This is one of my favorite videos. It's a bat eating his meal at our center. And I like to share it because if you're ever scared of bats or thought they weren't, ugly or scary or whatever the case may be, I feel like this video might change your mind. At least I hope so. Really hungry guy eating his meal there, really enjoying it. So we can see they don't look quite as threatening when we see them in that kind of capacity, eating their meal. So I am going a little long. I'm sorry, I do apologize. I think I spent a little too much time talking about these, but it's really important information. So if anybody has to leave, I totally understand, but I will continue. It'll probably be another 10 minutes or so. Yes.
One more question just for bats before we move on. Very
Sure.
quickly, how do bats survive the winter when they're not here at Toronto Wildlife Centre?
Yes, very good question. So they will go into a state called torpor or hibernation, basically. And so they'll live, some bats, live inside trees. Some bats migrate, first of all. So the ones that can't take our winters migrate, but other ones will like go under the bark of trees. Big brown bats, it's not uncommon for them to like roost under bridges or, inside walls of buildings. And they will slow their body down, go into a state of torpor or hibernation. And that maintains their fat stores throughout the entire winter. But if they come out of torpor too early and they have to fly around and they're using too much of that up, they won't have enough fat stores to last them until spring. So they're insectivores, right? So not a lot of insects to refuel during the winter. So they won't make it. And sometimes they could even succumb to the cold, depending on how cold it is outside. So so that's the reason why they do need to come into our center. A lot of the time we do, once they're stable, we do just put them in a really cold room and let them sort of, they don't go into a full state of torpor. We still have to feed them, but yeah, we just let them sort of try to mimic what they would be doing in the wild as much as possible. And then when it warms up, we do release them back out to their natural habitat in the spring. Yeah, great. So snakes, of course, snakes are another feared animal that get a bad rap. So Ontario has 17 species of snakes, and of course, the reason people fear them is because they think that they're venomous. However, only one snake is venomous in Ontario, and that's called the Massasauga rattler. And that population is more up along the Georgian Bay area, so they're not even in the greater Toronto area. But even for those snakes, they're very timid. They really don't want to be around people. And bites usually happen as a result of them either being provoked by someone or somebody stepping on them accidentally, because they can camouflage really well. However, we do have excellent anti-venom available, and no one has died from a Massasauga rattler bite in over 50 years. So again, the risk is very, very low, but they are persecuted. They are killed because out of fear, and that's why they're endangered. So we really need to do all we can to help people understand that they pose a very minimal risk. The chances of getting a Massasauga bite are very, very small, and that there are solutions available if that does happen, as well as habitat loss, another problem, as well as these other snakes as well. So some other things that are some myths that we'd like to address are that, you know, they're aggressive, snakes are timid. Most of the time, they're really just going to try and get away from you. Not slimy. In fact, their scales are very dry and smooth. And an interesting thing about them is that they don't chew their food. So they will eat their food whole, and they eat things like mice, lizards, frogs, tadpoles, bird eggs, very small things, right? So a human is a predator to a snake, and that's why they want to avoid us whenever they possibly can. You've probably often seen garter snakes in your backyard, under a wood pile, or in the park. You know, they're going to try and get away from you as fast as you can. People tend to get bit when they try picking them up. So snakes do need our help. Roads are a really big threat to them because they're a reptile. They need to warm up somewhere, and roads are nice and warm in the summertime. So they'll curl up there, and then of course they get hit by a car. So watching out for snakes on the road is a really big help that way you can help them. And also their habitat is disappearing. We can see all of these snakes listed here, all 9 of these snakes are listed at various degrees of being at risk. So some are endangered, some are threatened, but a lot of that is due to habitat loss. So the more we can protect our forests and wild areas, the more we'll be helping snakes and all the other wild animals that are also failing due to habitat loss. So moving on to some weird species. So I put weird in quotation marks because of course we love all species and they all have a role to play, but I say weird because people tend to call our hotline and refer to them as unusual or strange or weird. So we don't have kangaroos in Ontario. I'm sure most of you know that, but it is a little clue for the first animal that I'd like to talk about. What Ontario mammal is similar to a kangaroo? Any guesses? You can throw them in the chat if you have any guesses. I'm not seeing any guesses. Oh, yay. Beth and Vernon got it right. A possum. So they're similar because both are marsupials. So they carry their babies in a pouch. So when they're born, they're very, very tiny. They stay in the mother's pouch until they grow too big to fit. And then they will crawl up onto their mother's back, and she gives them a piggyback ride. She can have up to 14 babies. So that's a lot of work for Mama Opossum. But they are pretty interesting animals. They do now have established populations across Ontario. That's one thing we hear a lot is like, is it normal? I've never seen an opossum here. Are they supposed to be here? So yes, they have come from the south and they do live here now. The good thing about them is, unlike raccoons or squirrels that might try to den up on your property, they're pretty nomadic. They don't tend to stay in one place for a long time. And that's because they carry their babies with them, right? So they'll move around. You might find them under your deck or something a night or two, but they don't tend to stay in one area. Another great thing, which you may have heard already, is that they're famous for eating ticks. And I think all of us can agree that although I'm sure ticks have some sort of role in the ecosystem, that we don't want them near us. So they do munch on those. And they're really like not aggressive at all. And we've already talked a little bit about aggression in animals, that it's not, that there's always a reason that we just don't necessarily understand. But the way an opossum will defend itself is by playing possum or playing dead, right? They're going to sit there, they're going to lie there and be really, really still. And they might show you all of their 50 teeth to be scary. But that's kind of the extent of what they do. A lot of the time they will be, they get caught out in the daytime. So they'll be rummaging around at night. All of a sudden the sun comes up and they're like, oh, I'm not in a very good spot right now, but it's daylight and I really shouldn't move. So they'll stay in the same spot for the entire day. And we get lots of calls on our hotline about, there's an opossum up on my fence post and it's not leaving, it's not moving. And as long as it doesn't look injured at all, typically our advice is just leave it. By overnight, it's going to move on. And that's almost always what happens. So when do they need help? Cold winters. They are not really built for our cold environment. Their feet and their tail and their ears are pretty bare. There's nothing to keep them warm there. So they do suffer from frostbite occasionally or quite often. And they do come in. Sometimes we have to do some amputations on their tails if it's become frostbitten before we can release them back out into the wild. Babies found alone are also a cause for concern. So you saw the mom carrying all those babies on her back. Typically what happens is once they reach maturity, which is only about the size of my hand, they'll just hop off and off they go. That's the end of the care for them. But if they fall off too early, mama's not really keeping track of how many babies are on the back. So if they fall off, they're kind of on their own, they're automatically considered orphaned, and they need to come to our center in order for us to finish raising them. So I have another video for you to share, which is some little baby opossums that were being cared for at our center, having a little meal. And just for size reference, these guys would be getting pretty close to being independent. Not quite, but they're getting pretty close. A lot of people consider that, think that they're rats or rodents. And again, they're not related to rats. They are their own species. People often say, oh, they're ugly like a rat, but I don't know. When you see these little baby opossums, I think they steal a lot of people's hearts. Okay. Another unusual species we see is the American woodcock. Most people call us when they find these birds and they say, I found this really weird bird. It has a long beak. And we're like, American woodcock. They are strange. They're a migratory bird and they winter in the south of the USA. And their long beaks are used for probing the soil for earthworms. And that's how they capture their prey. And their eyes are really big so that they can see above them while they're foraging on the ground. So a little bit of an unusual look to them. We see them pass through during migration in Toronto, so every spring and fall. And unfortunately, windows again are a really big threat during migration. So I'm not sure how many of you came to our first presentation on birds where we covered mitigation techniques and the problems with windows. I won't get into it too much right now, but I do just want to show you some techniques to make your windows bird safe, because it's the reflection on the outside of windows that causes birds to hit. So this is feather friendly tape. You can get it at featherfriendly.com. and you put it on the outside of your windows, and those dots are enough to let birds know that there is a solid surface there. Window decals can be good too, but you have to put a lot of them on. Simply putting one decal on the middle of a window doesn't work because there's a lot of empty space around that decal that a bird may still try to fly to. There's also cords that can hang in front of windows, or if you have kids or grandkids, doing little crafts like gel clings to stick on the outside of window are also a really good idea. So more information is available at flap.org. That's flap.org. Again, I won't get too far into it, but I do like to share that information because migration is coming very shortly, and we're going to see a lot of birds hitting windows. So finally, my little section here, revered species. So we talked about there's 410 bird species, 38 mammal species. I can't cover them all, so I had to pick one. And this is a trumpeter swan, so a species that everybody tends to love. We don't get too many calls complaining about trumpeter swans at Toronto Wildlife Centre. And interesting about them is that they are a conservation success story. So their populations were severely depleted. There was about 125 years of a commercial swan skin harvest. So a lot of skins were being shipped back to Europe until finally they realized that there's a serious population problem beginning to happen. So restoration programs began in the 1930s and carried on through the 1960s to restore their populations. And it's great because the populations were down to anywhere between 60 and 70 individuals in the USA. They did up finding some more, a larger population in Alaska, Canada, but it was a pretty severe depletion. So now we know that they're back up into the tens of thousands, which is great. It's again, well-known conservation success story. So the Trumpeter Swan Society is an interesting group, and they operate here in Toronto as well. They continue this work of monitoring trumpeter swans, education, helping to capture injured ones that need to come to Toronto Wildlife Centre. Now, some things that are still affecting these swans are lead poisoning. So lead shot that had landed in the water, or lead sinkers that used to be used for fishing. Swans dabble down in the bottom of water and they will end up ingesting these lead pellets, and it can lead to lead poisoning for them. So we do see that from time to time. Of course, habitat loss, as always, is another concern. Sometimes they do fly into power lines, and occasionally shooting does continue to happen, even though that it is illegal. At TWC, we see many swans and other water birds admitted due to being tangled up in fishing line and fishing hooks. This is a really big problem for all water birds, not just trumpeter swans. So the next two videos I'm going to show you is of a mute swan, so not a trumpeter, but a mute, that had a piece of fishing tackle caught in its beak and required a rescue from Toronto Wildlife Centre.
Calling about a mute swan. She has got a really large metal fishing lure hanging from the inside of her mouth.
All right, now you can see that they pulled that fishing line all the way out. So if you ever do find a bird that has swallowed fishing hooks or line, make sure not to cut it because it does make it easier for our team to pull it out. And then our very last video for today is that same swan being released back to its family in the wild. So we were successfully able to rehabilitate the swan, and you'll see a really nice swan family reunion. It's a nice way to end our presentation for today. So we can see their mate coming in to greet them, welcome them back home. And the rest of the family too. So I do apologize for going a little bit long. I can get long-winded sometimes. So I appreciate everybody hanging on there with me. But if anybody has any questions, I know I could every single animal that we share our neighborhoods with, but hopefully got a better glimpse into a few of the species and how to peacefully coexist, and happy to answer any questions that you have. Oh, thank you for all the kind words too in the chat. That's lovely.
Okay, I want to thank Vicki very, very much. This has been a wonderful presentation and it was interesting to hear, you know, how maligned some of these little animals are, and nice of you to give us the information on how to help them out. I do want to remind everybody, we have one more session on April 6th, and Vicki says it'll be spectacular. So at 10 o'clock, mark it in your calendar, and we hope to see you then. Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you for Toronto Wildlife and on behalf of RTO District 23.
Well, thanks for including us again. We really appreciate it. And I did forget to mention, yes, the next one is on wild babies. So it will be by far the cutest.